Excitement here in New Zealand has been ignited for this tournament.
Hearing our fans being behind us is just unforgettable.
World football at the Women's World Cup from the BBC World Service.
We're going all the way, baby.
Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Welcome to The Enquiry with me, Audrey Brown. Each week, one question, 4 expert witnesses, and an answer. A new word entered the South African lexicon in late 2007. That word is load shedding. It described the process by which the power company Eskom occasionally reduced the demand for electricity on the national grid. Power would be shut off on rotation, and after a short while, it would come back on again. It didn't happen very often, so it was a minor irritation. That was then. Today,
in the past few months, Eskom has been rationing power in stages, with stage 6 being the highest. This leaves South Africans without power for up to at least 10 hours a day.
Spoiled food in refrigerators, appliances destroyed as unpredictable power surges back through the grid, small businesses closing down, adding to the huge number of unemployed people. Hospital patients dying because life-giving medical equipment can't operate without electricity. Traffic lights not functioning, so there's chaos on the streets. Water infrastructure failing, endangering the lives of millions because electricity is needed to pump clean water into households. So how did South Africa's infrastructure go from world-beating to decrepit and life-threatening for its citizens? This week on The Enquiry, we're asking, why is South Africa collapsing?
Part 1. Power to the people.
When Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa in 1994, he and his party, the African National Congress, promised a better life for all South Africans.
The time to build is upon us. We have at last achieved our political emancipation. We pledge ourselves to liberate all our people from the continuing bondage of poverty.
This promise went to the heart of what South Africans of all colours wanted from a new government. Black South Africans had long been deprived of the right to vote and the right to live a life of dignity in the land of their birth. Up to that point, white South Africans had enjoyed all the advantages of a prosperous, wealthy state set up to benefit them and them alone. Black South Africans were forced to live in squalor, impoverished and downtrodden. Duma Kubule is an economist and journalist in Johannesburg. He explained the nature of the South African economy when the ANC came into power.
It was an economy that was geared to serve the white minority, which currently is less than 10% of the population. So you had a white minority that lived, first world per capita income. And then you had a black majority that had the per capita incomes of like a very poor third world country in Africa. So that, in a summary, was the type of economy that the ANC inherited.
What we must remember is that South Africa's economy was based on mining and monopoly. 5 or 6 very powerful companies controlled the economy. They also wielded massive political influence. South Africa had the wherewithal to provide for all its people. It had the biggest, most industrialized economy in Africa. It had modern cities and amenities. So the African National Congress began reorganizing the way in which state resources were distributed. Electrification, that's the ambition to bring power to all the people, was central to those plans. And Eskom was the vehicle to deliver it. So what ambitions, though, did they have for South Africa when they first entered government?
Well, there was a document called the Reconstruction and Development Program. It is an amazing vision for the development of the South African economy, whereby the government would invest in the people and the infrastructure to eradicate apartheid backlogs. So what they did, there was the electrification, which was very successful. The government gave annual budget to Eskom to extend electricity to the majority of South Africans, to Black South Africans. And also there was the whole issue of housing. So the ANC did provide a lot of houses, but subsequent to that, when we look at them now, we wonder about the quality of those houses and so forth. But there was a lot of basic infrastructure, electricity, housing, water, and so forth was extended to many people at the time. Yeah.
But then, things seem to go wrong. Plans and projects to continue providing better healthcare, better education, a better life for all seem to stall.
I think we romanticized the ANC and we thought they were actually prepared for what was to follow. And they had a document in 1992 called Ready to Govern. And, most of us thought they had spent 30 years in exile and preparing for this moment of the liberation. But as we've subsequently found, they were not really prepared. They weren't ready to govern at the time.
The ANC was also under serious pressure from the forces at play in the early 1990s, both inside the country and further afield. The Iron Curtain had come down, so one of the biggest influences on its economic thinking had collapsed, the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, privatization, Thatcherism, was all the rage. And South Africa's business conglomerates were able to exercise a very particular kind of pressure.
The 5 or 6 conglomerates in South Africa, they convinced the ANC that they should be allowed to invest overseas and list their companies overseas. And so it's absurd. South Africa needs the resources for development, but you're allowing your largest companies to disinvest from the South African economy and move to London and look for new opportunities, in the rest of the world. So that's what happened as well during that period. So the ANC was acting right and talking left, and it was almost like a schizophrenic ideology or personality that the organization had, yeah.
The effect of all this was a disinvestment in the welfare of the people and the things that would make their lives better, like the electricity Eskom could provide to power reconstruction, growth and development.
Yes. So now we have an unviable economy, record unemployment, record poverty. Half the population lives in poverty. At the same time, we have the highest inequality in the world. So the top 10% owns 86% of the wealth. Our country is an unviable society. Our GDP per capita has not grown for 15 years. And then the projection is that we're going to have 3 more years of declining GDP per capita. By 2025, our GDP will be lower, per capita will be lower than it was in 2007. We can't continue like this.
Part 2. Things fall apart.
Load shedding is the modern word for blackout. My name is Thomas Mnguni. I'm a campaigner with Groundwork. Groundwork is an environmental justice and development NGO which works throughout Southern Africa and Africa.
Let's talk about load shedding and its disruptive impact on the lives of ordinary people.
Our lives have been heavily reliant on electricity, so everything we do requires electricity. So even a single hour without electricity is bad.
Thomas remembers a time when life was good back in the 1990s.
So a couple of years, the service was pretty good. But over the years, for I think a variety of reasons, we don't see that kind of service anymore.
Now, people live 4, 6, 8, up to 10 hours a day without electricity. From January to May this year, Thomas and millions of South Africans like him experienced more days without power than the whole of 2022. And 2022 was really, really bad. How do people manage that?
I think for most people, we don't manage. We just have to adapt, because even though there are other alternatives to generate our electricity, most ordinary people cannot afford. For instance, installing a rooftop solar in your house. So you just have to adjust your plans and your work based on the information in the public domain about when load shedding is going to affect you.
It goes without saying that in a country where more than half the population is unemployed, where hundreds of thousands of people rely on a small sum of money given to them by the government, and tens of thousands more are losing their jobs because businesses, big and small, can't keep the lights on. Load shedding is taking its toll.
Look, there's a lot of anger. There's also a lot of desperation to say, what is it that I can do to earn a livelihood? And instead of saying we'll wait for government or we'll wait for the private sector, they take to the streets. Whether people are listening or not, they will listen if we push them. That's the kind of message they're sending, And because they've lost hope of negotiation, this is the kind of trend we're seeing where people will want to use violence to get attention and to resolve their problems.
It got so bad. There's been a cholera outbreak.
I think in different areas over the past few months, we have seen how load shedding has affected the provision of services. For instance, the maintenance of sewer plants, the provision of bulk water in households. So it not only destroyed appliances at the household level, but it also destroyed the huge infrastructure that we've become dependent on to have access to basic services like clean, drinkable water.
And the dangers to people's health don't end there.
People are now becoming heavily dependent on burning coal indoors for warmth, for cooking, for boiling water. And that has a huge health impact because any form of coal combustion has emissions, and those emissions basically affect people's health. So it becomes not only an energy crisis, but it also becomes a huge health crisis.
This takes us back to the dark days of apartheid, when smoke hazes blanketed impoverished townships. How did we get here?
Hi, I'm Hannah. I am the host of a new daily podcast, What in the World, from the BBC World Service, where we try to help you make sense of the world around you, explaining the big events and some of the smaller events, so that you might feel a little bit better when you pick up your phone and scroll through your newsfeed. Just search for What in the World wherever you get your BBC podcasts and hit subscribe.
Part 3. Why is the light fading?
Hi Audrey, my name's Anton Eberhard and I'm a professor at the Power Futures Lab at the University of Cape Town.
Let's start by talking about what kind of a company Eskom was when the African National Congress took over the running of the country back in 1994.
Yeah, so Eskom is state-owned. It was the largest electricity company on the continent of Africa. In fact, Eskom supplied more than 50% of the electricity generated in Africa. So it was technically very, very competent. It was financially sound. It had a surplus of generation capacity. So ideally suited for a new democratic government as it came to power to serve the developmental state, to be a key element of the reconstruction and development program, and a key driver of the electrification program, which lifted access rates to the majority of the people.
Ready and capable as it was to do this, policy U-turns, political infighting, corruption, among other factors, meant that Eskom was fatally hobbled. But what exactly went wrong, and why?
Planning failures, a loss of skills, inadequate maintenance of the plant, state capture, repurposing and disruption of governance, and corruption. So I was part of a team with government that wrote the energy policy white paper in 1998, and we warned that we would run out of electricity generation capacity by 2007 unless Eskom invested in new power. And that's exactly what happened. Eskom didn't invest in time. It was partly because government was wanting to restructure the sector and bring in the private investment. It never went through with that plan. And so at the last minute came back to Eskom and said build, but it was too late. So planning failures, too little was done too late.
We'll go into more detail of just how bad governance, bad business, and factional politics crippled this once thriving entity. But let's look at what effect a particular event, a very prestigious event, had on Eskom's functioning.
As the spare capacity ran out, as there was less of a reserve margin, there was less space to take plant off to maintain properly. And I remember very well the period leading to the 2010 FIFA World Cup, which was held in South Africa. And government said to Eskom, keep the lights on at all costs. The world is watching us. We have to perform. And one of the consequences is that they skipped maintenance then. And in effect, Eskom has never quite caught up. They always have been behind. And, when you have old plant that is not maintained properly, and Eskom's power generation units are older than 40 years on average, then it's not surprising that this plant breaks down frequently. We survived that period, but the consequences of skimping on maintenance began to be felt in ensuing years. So we had rotating power cuts in 2014 and 15, and then a short respite again. But we've had power cuts in South Africa every year since 2018, and every year they've got worse.
So politics, policy, and the desire for prestige saw Eskom pushed to its very limits. But criminality and corruption are mostly what South Africans blame for the darkening state of affairs.
They would divert quality coal destined for Eskom power stations, and they would substitute it with an inferior coal and then direct the higher quality coal for exports and earn much higher income. And that has had a massive impact on the performance of coal power stations. Equally, people who have maintenance contracts have worked with staff in Eskom to deliberately break equipment so that they would be called upon to supply spare parts and to do the maintenance. And it's been incredibly difficult to turn this around. And this is one of the big challenges that Eskom faces currently.
Part 4. It's not easy being green.
The ANC faces a crucial election next year. For the first time, its political support could dip below 50% of the vote. This is a psychological threshold its leaders have long feared being breached. It might be too late to dilute the strength of feeling against the organization. But after years of apparent indifference to the suffering caused by the power crisis and the infrastructure collapse, the ANC finally appears to be willing to act. Lungile Mashele is an energy economist, and she's been studying what's being done right now to address the crisis.
So one of the very good things that government has done, I'd say, over the last 9 or so months, is to bring in a very competent board of skilled individuals who are starting to see the results of that. They've gone back to engineering, they've gone back to good project management principles. So we're already starting to bear the fruits of that.
So far, so good, I suppose. But let's not forget, Eskom has had 13 or 14 CEOs in the last decade. So internal reorganization is not the silver bullet. President Cyril Ramaphosa is accused of doing nothing to stop the crisis. But we must remember, he's paralyzed by infighting and factionalism within the ANC. There is political power at play here. But of course, a long-term plan is desperately needed. And it seems that there is finally one on the table. It's called the Integrated Resource Plan.
That is our energy plan that looks at a 20-year outlook and says what should South Africa be investing in, what technologies should it be looking at, and what capacities. And typically for the last 10 years or so, it has been gas as well as renewables, a lot of renewables. And it has also said perhaps coal.
Renewables come up quite a lot. South Africa has sunshine for endless days, wind and wave power, surrounded as it is by 2 oceans. But it all comes back to coal. And that's why it's not that easy being green in South Africa.
Absolutely. So if you look at South Africa's current energy mix, it's about 80% is made up like of coal, and the other 20% is a little bit of hydro, nuclear, and renewables. And because of South Africa's social makeup and its economic makeup, a lot of our energy, even going forward, whether we like it or not, is actually going to be coal. Coal on its own has about 90,000 direct employees who are employed by coal mines. Then, of course, you can think of the multiplier effect around the coal value chain, the coal truck drivers, those who do the coal trains, as well as like the freight, so there's an entire value chain there. And that if you disrupt that, you could possibly see South Africa collapse even further. And I don't think we have the room for that anymore.
I remember in the good old days, the 90s, early 2000s, when South Africa's electricity was the cheapest in the world. And if there was a blip in the system and your lights stripped, you just waited for it to go back on. No panic whatsoever. Will we ever get back to those days?
It's hard to actually say. I mean, just this morning, I woke up to a notification that there was no electricity. It had gone off at 3 a.m. and most likely as a result of cable theft. And it came back at 10 a.m. And after that, I'm going to be subjected to scheduled load shedding throughout the day as well. And I really want to emphasize that it does have a psychological impact on you. Temperatures are extremely low. Just this week on Monday, it was actually snowing in Johannesburg. So you can imagine coming back home and you can't even warm yourself up. You can't do anything.
So we return to the question, why is South Africa collapsing? The answer is not simple. A powerful, well-meaning but inexperienced ANC inherited a massively skewed economy back in 1994. It tried to deliver not just the dreams of freedom, but the fruits of prosperity for millions of South Africans. Internal and external politics thwarted those attempts. Global economic instability didn't help. Corruption and criminality deferred those dreams even further. Millions of people who never had electricity did get some. But remember, electrification didn't reach everyone the first time around. Millions of people still live in shanty towns with no sanitation, no roads, no lights. If the leaders of South Africa don't get it right, those people will never catch up. Next year will be the 30th anniversary of that historic election in South Africa, when everyone was inspired by the vision and the electoral promise of a better life for all. Maybe the people South Africans choose next time will try harder to fix things. The inquiry was presented by me, Audrey Brown, produced by Louise Clark, and researched by Anushka Mutanda-Doherty. The editor is Tara McDermott, and it was mixed by Kelly Young.